What happens when a CEO goes undercover as an intern and overhears his own managers mocking their staff? James Carter had built his company from the ground up. Over the past 15 years, he had expanded it into a successful corporate chain with 12 locations across the country. But lately, something felt off. Employee turnover was rising, customer complaints were piling up, and despite strong revenue, morale seemed to be at an all-time low. He had heard the excuses from his executives: "It's just a rough patch. Some employees just don't have the right attitude. We're doing everything we can," but James wasn't convinced. He wanted the truth, the raw and unfiltered reality of what was happening in his company. So he made a decision. He would go undercover as an intern at one of his stores. A week later, James walked into one of his locations, now unrecognizable. His usual clean-cut look was gone, his hair was dyed a darker shade, his beard slightly unkempt, and he wore thick-rimmed glasses. He dressed in basic slacks and a polo, nothing that screamed corporate executive. No one here had ever met him personally. He had always dealt with regional managers, never store-level staff. "Hey, you must be Jason, the new intern." A young woman greeted him as he stepped inside. "Yeah, that's me," James said, adjusting his glasses. "I'm Emily. I'll be showing you around today. Welcome to the team." She smiled warmly. Emily was in her mid-20s, her uniform neatly pressed, her posture confident but approachable. She had the energy of someone who genuinely cared about the job. James spent the morning shadowing her, learning the basics: stocking shelves, handling customer inquiries, and assisting at the register. Emily was patient and thorough, explaining everything as if she truly wanted him to succeed. But as the day went on, James started noticing cracks in the system. The break room was in terrible condition, an old microwave barely worked, the fridge was packed with expired food, and the coffee machine looked like it hadn't been cleaned in months. Employees were rushed, barely getting time for breaks. And worst of all, some of the managers treated their staff like they were disposable. At lunch, James overheard two managers talking in the back office. "Did you see how slow Sarah was today? I swear, these employees are useless. She's got 2 kids and takes the bus, probably too tired to function." The other laughed. James clenched his fists. "And that new intern, Jason or whatever, probably another idiot will have to babysit," the first manager scoffed. James' jaw tightened. They had no idea who he was, and they were this dismissive. "Honestly, these people act like they're struggling, but if they worked harder, they wouldn't be stuck in these dead-end jobs," the other manager added. James had heard enough. He turned and walked away before his anger got the best of him. That night, he couldn't sleep. His employees weren't just overworked, they were disrespected. And if this was happening at one location, how many others had the same toxic culture? Tomorrow, he would dig deeper. The next morning, James arrived 10 minutes early, determined to observe more before anyone noticed him. The store was already buzzing with activity trucks unloading merchandise, employees rushing to get shelves stocked before the doors opened. Emily greeted him with a tired smile. "Ready for another day, Jason?" "Yeah," James nodded. "You look exhausted. Long shift." She laughed softly. "Always, I close tonight too, but it's fine, overtime helps." James made a mental note of that. Employees working long hours just to make ends meet while managers mock them behind closed doors? Unacceptable. Today, he was assigned to work with a man named Lewis, a stockroom associate who had been with the company for 6 years. Lewis was in his early 40s, a hardworking family man who took pride in efficiency. "You ever stocked shelves before?" Lewis asked, tapping a clipboard against his palm. "Not really," James admitted. "No worries." Lewis handed him a box cutter. "Just be careful with this. Management doesn't like accidents, trust me." James noticed the way Louis said it with a hint of something unsaid. They worked side by side, unloading boxes and arranging items neatly. Louis moved fast, his hands practiced and precise. James struggled to keep up. "You'll get the hang of it," Louis assured him. "Just don't let them see you slow down too much." James glanced at him. "Why?" Louis hesitated, then sighed. "They cut hours if they think you're not pulling your weight, and if you get injured, you're on your own." James frowned. "That can't be right." Louis let out a humorless chuckle. "Tell that to Danny." "Who's Danny?" Louis lowered his voice. "Worked here for almost a decade. Slipped in the back, hurt his knee bad. Management said they'd file a report. Next thing he knew, his hours got cut until he was forced to quit. No severance, no help, just gone." James felt a fire ignite in his chest. This wasn't just bad management, it was neglect. Later that afternoon, James found himself at the front register, shadowing Emily again. She handled a long line of customers with patience, even when some were rude or demanding. But then a woman with 2 young kids approached. She looked tired, her clothes slightly worn. She placed a few items on the counter, basic necessities: milk, bread, baby formula. Emily rang up the total. The woman's face fell when she saw the number. She hesitated, then murmured, I think I'll just take the formula and the bread." James watched as Emily subtly scanned a coupon from her pocket. The total dropped. The woman's eyes widened. "Oh, thank you." Emily just smiled. "No problem at all." James felt a lump in his throat. Here was an employee going out of her way to help someone in need, while management sat in the back making jokes about their staff. But then, a sharp voice cut through the moment. "Emily." A manager stormed over Nathan, one of the men James had overheard yesterday. "Step into my office, now." Emily stiffened. Now," Nathan snapped. James watched as she swallowed hard and nodded, disappearing into the back. A few minutes later, she returned, her face pale. "What happened?" James asked quietly. Emily forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Nothing, just, I need to be more professional at the register." James clenched his jaw. She had been reprimanded for showing kindness. That was the breaking point. He had seen enough. Tomorrow, he would reveal who he really was, and changes were coming. James arrived at the store earlier than usual, his mind set on the confrontation ahead. He had seen enough employees overworked, mistreated, and undervalued while managers upheld a toxic culture. Today, he would put an end to it. He walked through the aisles, the store slowly coming to life as employees clocked in. Emily was already at the front, her usual warm demeanor dimmed by what had happened yesterday. Louis was in the stockroom, moving boxes with the quiet efficiency of someone who had long accepted that no one above him cared. James took a deep breath and made his way toward the back office. Nathan and the other manager, Greg, were inside, laughing over their morning coffee. They didn't even glance at him as he stepped in. "Hey, new intern," Greg said dismissively, not bothering to look up from his phone. "What do you want?" James shut the door behind him. For the first time, he dropped the act. His posture straightened, his voice firm. "I want to talk about how you run this place." Nathan scoffed, finally glancing at him. "Excuse me." James reached up and removed his glasses, his expression unreadable. "I've seen how you treat employees, how you cut hours, mock your staff, and punish people for doing the right thing." His voice was calm, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. Greg frowned. "Who do you think you are?" James let the silence stretch for a moment before speaking again. "I'm James Carter." Both men froze. Nathan blinked. "What?" James took a step forward. "I own this company, And I've spent the past few days working in this store, listening to everything you thought no one important would hear." Greg's face went pale. Nathan opened his mouth, then closed it. "You've created a culture where employees are disposable and fear speaking up," James continued. "I heard you mock Sarah for struggling as a single mother. I heard how you laughed about cutting Danny's hours until he had no choice but to quit. I watched you reprimand Emily for helping a struggling mother buy formula." His voice sharpened. "And you thought that was leadership." Nathan finally found his voice. "Sir, I—" "Don't," James cut him off, his tone ice cold. "Don't try to talk your way out of this." The office door suddenly opened, and Emily stood there, confusion and shock on her face. She had clearly overheard. Behind her, Lewis and a few other employees had gathered, their eyes widening as they realized what was happening. James turned to them. "Emily, Lewis, all of you deserve better than this, and I'm here to make sure that happens." He faced Nathan and Greg again. "Effective immediately, you're both fired." Greg sputtered, "Wait, you can't just—" "I can," James interrupted. "And I am. Security will escort you out. You will not be receiving recommendations, and I will personally ensure that no other store in this company operates under this kind of leadership again." Nathan's face twisted with anger, but he knew there was no way out. He grabbed his things, pushing past the employees as he stormed toward the exit. Greg followed, his head down. Silence filled the store. Then slowly, Emily spoke. "You're really James Carter." James nodded. Lewis exhaled deeply. "Damn." James looked at them, his voice softer now. "I started this company because I believed in treating people right. Somewhere along the way, I let myself get too distant. That changes today." He turned back to the gathered employees. "New management will be brought in, leaders who respect you, who value you. Wages will be reviewed. Hours will be adjusted fairly. And anyone who feels they've been mistreated will have direct access to corporate to report it." Emily's eyes glistened. "Thank you." Lewis clapped him on the shoulder. "About time." James nodded. "This isn't just about fixing this store. It's about fixing the entire company. And I promise, from this moment forward, things will be different." By the next morning, James had already begun restructuring the store's leadership. A regional manager arrived to oversee operations temporarily while corporate reviewed applications for a new store manager. Word spread quickly. Employees who once felt unheard now had a direct line to the top. James spent the day meeting individually with staff, listening to their concerns, their frustrations, and their hopes for a better work environment. Many had been afraid to speak up before, fearing retaliation. Now, with Nathan and Greg gone, they finally felt comfortable being honest. Emily sat across from him in the break room, her hands folded on the table. "I never thought anyone up top would actually care," she admitted. "I mean, we'd hear about leadership wanting to support us, but it always felt like empty words." James leaned forward. "That's on me. For too long, I trusted reports and numbers instead of the people who make this company run. That changes now." She hesitated before speaking again. "What happens next?" James smiled. "For starters, employees like you will have a say in how things improve. You've been here long enough to know what works and what doesn't. I want suggestions, real ones, from the people who actually do the work." Emily's face lit up with cautious optimism. "Honestly, better training. A lot of people get thrown into roles with barely any guidance, and fair scheduling. So many of us struggle with unpredictable shifts." James nodded, making a note. "Consider it done." Lewis was next. He sat down with the same quiet strength he always carried, but for the first time, there was something new in his posture. Hope. "I'll be honest," he said. "I thought this was just another stunt. Some CEO coming in, making promises, then disappearing." James met his gaze. I don't blame you for thinking that, but I'm not disappearing. In fact, I'm setting up a system where every store has direct communication with corporate. No more middle management burying problems. Lewis studied him for a moment before nodding. Good, because people like Danny, they deserved better. James felt a pang of guilt for how long it had taken him to see the reality of his company. I've already reached out to Danny. He's getting a severance package and the option to return if he wants. Lewis's brows lifted in surprise. Didn't think you'd actually follow through. James chuckled. I'm getting that a lot today. The following days were filled with change. The break room was cleaned and stocked with fresh supplies. A new scheduling policy was implemented, ensuring fair shift distribution. Employee wages were reassessed, and raises were given where overdue. But more than the policies, the atmosphere shifted. Employees who had once walked on eggshells now spoke freely. Teamwork improved. Morale began to rebuild. James made one final visit before leaving standing in front of the entire staff as they gathered near the registers at closing time. I came here undercover because I wanted the truth, he said. And what I found was both frustrating and eye-opening. You all work hard, and you deserve respect, fair pay, and leadership that values you. He let his gaze sweep over the crowd. This isn't just about this store, it's about the entire company. What happened here won't happen anywhere else again. Emily smiled, standing beside Lewis. A few employees nodded, some even clapped. James took a breath. But I don't just want to fix problems, I want to prevent them. So, starting today, I'll be visiting stores regularly. Unannounced. No one will know when or where, because leadership should never be so far removed that they forget what it's like to be on the ground. A murmur of approval spread through the group. As James stepped outside, the night air crisp and cool, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: certainty. He had built this company from nothing, and now he was making sure it truly stood for something. James didn't waste time after leaving the store. He returned to corporate headquarters with a fire in his chest and a clear mission: to overhaul the way his company operated from the ground up. The first step was an emergency meeting with his executive team. He sat at the head of the long conference table, scanning the faces of the people who had been feeding him surface-level reports for years. Some looked uneasy, others oblivious. I spent the last week working undercover at one of our stores, James began, his voice steady but firm. And what I saw was unacceptable. Murmurs rippled through the room. A few executives exchanged glances, clearly caught off guard. James continued. Employees overworked, disrespected, and afraid to speak up. Customers being mistreated. Managers who think their staff are disposable. He let the weight of his words settle before adding, and all of this happened under our watch. One of the senior HR executives, Linda, cleared her throat. James, I understand your concerns, but we've always had policies in place to prevent this kind of behavior. If there were issues, why weren't they reported? James turned his gaze on her. Because reporting systems don't work when employees are afraid of retaliation. Because toxic managers make sure complaints never reach us. And because we've been too disconnected to see what was happening firsthand. A silence. Then his chief operating officer, Mark, leaned forward. What do you suggest? James didn't hesitate. Effective immediately, we're restructuring our management oversight. Every regional manager will be personally responsible for conducting anonymous employee check-ins. Any complaints against store-level management will be investigated directly by corporate, not filtered through the same people causing the problems. A few executives nodded, but others looked uncertain. I'm also increasing wages across all locations, James added. We're losing good people because we're not paying them enough to stay. That stops now. Another murmur spread through the room. The CFO, Richard, frowned. James, that's a major financial commitment. We need to analyze the numbers before making a decision like that. James met his gaze. I've already run the numbers. The cost of high turnover, poor customer retention, and low morale is far worse than the cost of paying people fairly. Richard hesitated, then gave a slow nod. James wasn't finished. And I'm implementing a direct line from employees to corporate, a system where they can submit concerns anonymously without fear of retaliation. Every submission will be reviewed personally by a new accountability task force. He paused, and I'll be reviewing them myself. That sent a ripple of surprise through the room. You're going to personally oversee employee complaints? Linda asked, eyebrows raised. Yes, James said simply, because leadership should never be so far removed that they forget who actually keeps this company running. The room fell silent again, but this time it wasn't resistance, it was realization. Mark finally spoke, then let's get to work. Over the next few weeks, change swept through the company. One by one, store managers were evaluated. Those who had fostered toxic environments were removed. New leadership training programs were developed, focusing on employee respect, fair scheduling, and accountability. Wages were adjusted. Employees who had been struggling to make ends meet found relief in their paychecks. For the first time in years, turnover rates began to drop. And then, the anonymous reporting system launched. Within days, reports poured in from stores all over the country. Some were minor grievances, scheduling conflicts, small management disputes. Others revealed deeper issues, exposing managers who had been abusing their power for years. James read every single one. And he acted. In one store, a manager had been pressuring employees to work off the clock to meet unrealistic sales goals. He was fired. In another, an assistant manager had been harassing employees, with complaints previously ignored by regional leadership. He was not only terminated, but reported to the appropriate authorities. James made sure that every action taken was transparent. Employees saw results. They saw that speaking up led to real change. And slowly, the culture of fear and silence began to shift. One evening, weeks after the undercover experience that started it all, James received an email. It was from Emily. James, I just wanted to say thank you, not just for what you did at our store, but for showing us that people at the top actually care. Things are better now, not perfect, but better. And for the first time in a long time, I actually look forward to coming to work. James sat back in his chair, a slow smile forming. This was just the beginning.